Hello, my name's Briers, sometimes known as the Rev, and I'm going to offer a spiritual response to a question I've been sent today. So the question I have here is not a discrete question I can just read out. It was a much longer message about grief. I was very touched to receive this message. It came a little out of the blue. But I feel really touched by the vulnerability people are showing in the kind of messages that they're sending to me and the responses that they're asking for. So I want to honour that vulnerability and really give a good response here. So the question was from someone for whom a family member has died relatively recently, and they're struggling to deal with their grief. And I hear about this a lot. And I can identify it with it myself. My mum died a bit more than 5 years ago now, and losing someone that close is hard, and it's painful. And one of the things that was specifically asked about in this message was about that it's hard to talk about the feelings of grief. It's hard to find ways to express them, and I can identify with that, and I want to respond to that. And then the other part was about that even if I choose to express my feelings of grief, if I give it expression, a kind of fear of losing control because it feels so big that when will it end? Will I ever stop crying? I often hear that with grief, and I know I had some feeling of that myself. So the first thing I want to mention about grief is that typically for most people who lose someone close to them, for between 3 and 6 months there's a period of shock, of being in shock. So don't necessarily expect yourself to experience or fully express your grief swiftly, and certainly don't feel guilty about about not crying a lot or not getting very upset, because it's really not uncommon for it either to just kind of bubble to the surface quite explosively during that first period, or for you to just be numb, just kind of in shock for that first 3 to 6 months. That's why often people actually are quite quick to get back to work, quicker than you might expect after they've lost a loved one, because they're just in shock, they're just kind of numb. And equally, as you hit that 3-month mark and thereafter, just keep an eye on yourself, ask for help, try and make sure that you're well supported during that time, because there is a good chance that the grief will return to you and be quite extreme, quite intense. So the thing about the feelings being hard to talk about, it can be really hard to talk about grief because it's such a big emotion, and yet in some ways so hard to pin down. You know, there's sadness, there's anger, there's pain, there's upset. Sometimes there can be joy just in the feeling of releasing the grief as the grief comes out. It's such a mix of emotions. It can be really hard to express. And it is also a very particular emotion. In my experience of it, it's a very particular feeling in and of itself, for which I don't have any other word than grief. And you know, sometimes it's extreme and it's very obvious, and there'll be tears, and it'll be very clear and easy for someone else to see what's going on with me and to see what I'm expressing. And there'll be other times where, in my experience of it, the grief is just near the surface, and there's a background kind of sadness or melancholy that I just have to give space to and keep breathing with. There's nothing more I can do with it than that. And that can be the hardest to express in some ways, because it can feel like, well, what am I feeling? How do I tell someone about it? How do they understand? How do I help them understand? So I'd really encourage you to just allow that to be the case if you're feeling that grief coming near the surface, and just allow it to be the case, and maybe find ways with those who are near to you to talk about it so that they can understand it a bit. Even if that's just to say, you know, sometimes I'm going to feel grief. It's going to be near the surface. I'll just be a little bit lower, a little bit sad. To let them know that in advance, so that when it does happen, you don't have to explain it a lot to them. You can just say, my grief is near the surface today. And they can know to leave you be or give you a hug, or, you know, let them know what you need in those moments, so that it doesn't become awkward or a block to communication in your relationships. And in terms of the fear of losing control, I really understand that. There were times when my grief was still quite new, when my mum had died, where I felt like it just took everything I had in me to stay standing. And it felt like if I expressed any of my grief, I'd just collapse and maybe never get up. And maybe that was true. You know, maybe at times there was space for a kind of constructive denial, not to suppress the feelings, but to just kind of contain them and not let them run away with me for then. And at some point you need to give them expression, because otherwise they'll just stay bottled up in there forever, and that is a road to a lot of pain, long term. So my suggestion would just be to make sure you get to express it at some point. And I'd also offer that I've never met anyone who started crying and never stopped crying. And I've done some work with people with kind of psychological issues, actual forms of mental illness, and even them I've not found that they started crying and just never stopped crying. The grief is not a bottomless well. And if at some point you can find a safe space where you're held and supported by people that love you, where you can just let yourself have your grief, where you can give yourself up to the grief, knowing that at some point it'll subside, you'll come back to being a little more grounded and centred, the joy will return. If you can allow yourself that expression, find a space for that expression, then I think that'll be a very healing thing. So the flip side of that is that thing of it feeling like it's too big, and just ending up, when people say, "Oh, are you all right?" because they see you're upset or something, just end up going, "Yeah, I'm okay," or "I'm fine," or whatever that phrase is that you use. And you know what? Again, I'd say I think that's normal. I think it's healthy at times to not want to go there. To not want to always be feeling grief all the time, because once it starts hitting, it can feel like it's just in the background all the time. And again, with your loved ones particularly, who may find it harder to understand or harder to take when you don't want to talk about your feelings and they can see that you're upset, to just set the expectation, to have that discussion with them so that they know if you say, "I'm okay," or you can just let them know, "My grief's near the surface today, but I'm doing okay," that they can let that go and not feel like you're shutting them out. Yeah. So, another factor that sometimes happens for people is guilt. Feeling guilty that they are moving on, that they do feel okay sometimes. But my mum's died, and how can it be okay? How can I feel okay? How can the world be okay when mum has died? And that's tough. That's tough to face that. And what I'd really encourage you to do is, for one thing, reflect on. So for me, would my mum want me to feel that guilt? Because if she was around, I can say pretty much for sure no. And then the other piece is to see if you can find ways, this helped me, is to find those ways in which I still feel connected to them, so that even when I'm happy, actually I'm happy and they're with me when I'm happy, rather than I'm happy and I've forgotten about them, which is sometimes where the guilt can feel like it comes from. So finding those kind of joyful, subtle, beautiful ways that person that you've lost, that person that's died, is still with you. And there was a lovely story shared with me by a friend just after my mum had died, of her grandmother having died, and she'd never been a baker, she'd never baked cakes, but all of a sudden, just very soon after her grandmother died, she just started baking cakes. Without using recipes even, I think, but just started baking cakes and was baking really nice cakes, and it was something her grandmother had always been very good at. And she heard a story that in some cultures it's considered that when someone dies, their gifts get passed on to the family. So if they were good at something, or so it's not just their physical belongings that get passed on to the family, but the gifts in themselves get passed on to those who are loved by them and those who are near to them. And I know for myself, I had an experience like that with my mother, that it was both more subtle and less clear than that in some ways, but that I felt very much that she was close to me and certain things happening. It was particularly around a relationship that started. I was wanting to have a loving relationship, and I had wanted one for a long time, and that started to move, and I met someone not that long after my mum had died, and that's actually my wife and mother of my child. So that was a very beautiful thing for me, to have that sense that in some way my mum was taking a hand in my life and helping me move on in having a loving relationship. And it means that she's still very present in my life. So I hope those perspectives, my point of view on grief, helps any of you who are experiencing grief now or have in the past or will in the future. And let's face it, all of us will at some point. And as ever, I offer my response, I offer my perspective with love.